This is November 7th, 2022, in Seattle, Washington. I'm Judith Y., Archives Chair for District 40, and my home group is Saturday Promises. I'm here today with Jean. So Jean, would you introduce yourself, give your home group and your sobriety date?
Okay, I'm Jean Z. I'm an alcoholic woman. I have been sober since July 23rd, 1981. And my home group for the past many years now has been practice these principles, a daily meeting, but I also have a couple other meetings that are daily or multiple times a week that probably rank as home groups also, but I stick to one.
Do you want to share their names as well?
A Spiritual Awakening, which is a women's daily midday meeting. And the other one is called, I'm pretty sure, Spiritual Awakening. Mostly different subset of women that is 3 days a week. And both these meetings are women's meetings.
Okay, so could you tell us a little bit about, how you started drinking, what happened, how you came to AA?
Yeah, my first step. Well, I actually grew up in a home where there was some drinking. We never had much. I think we were considered poor. We were, but I was never homeless, and I was always provided the essentials. And I also lived in a home with 2 loving parents and a number of siblings. And I was sober a couple years before I recognized that my father was probably the practicing alcoholic in my home, and he was a binge drinker. But he did the best he could taking care of his family, and in fact, he always did. I realize now, after years of recovery and some in Al-Anon and, always in Alcoholics Anonymous, that my poor mother was a raging codependent and a wonderful woman. That's what was going on. So there was a lot of dysfunction, but also enough safety and love that I was raised. But I always thought I have it from a strange home that I was not particularly proud of. I was kind of embarrassed that we were poor and that some of the things that went on. But in retrospect, as an adult and with some sobriety and maturity, it was actually a very good, decent home. And I was one of the lucky children. So anyway, I was always an overachiever because I was mostly trying to prove myself that I had a right to be here, that I had some value, because inherently I did not believe that in myself at all. So I was always striving to look okay and not let anybody see all what I considered terrible flaws. And I was not seeking alcohol. I did not understand. I didn't believe I was seeking anything for relief, although I do recognize now that I was a compulsive overeater, and that filled somewhat of a niche. But I really accidentally got very drunk when I was about 16 because I was finishing a job where I was the good girl, really hard worker, and they all the adults, and I was a young person in this restaurant business. I was always treated kindly, but I just worked really hard because I felt that was what I was supposed to do. And I was allowed to do that. This was back in the late 60s. And so my last day of work before I left for college, the bartenders who, thought I was this great kid were going to send me off and give me some free drinks. And they were having a ball. And I was drinking everything they handed me, and actually went into the bathroom a couple times and puked because I drank so much. But by the time another adult who actually was a family friend and was mortified that this had happened, because she was one of the waitresses there, and that I was barely standing and she had to drive me home. And I do remember I vomited in her car and she went, "Oh no, I was hoping we could avoid that." And she had to bring me into my parents. And they were like, "Oh my gosh," I passed out and I woke up, had several days awful hangover and missed a few things. And I didn't think that that was like something I should really repeat. But the the fact is, any other opportunities I got and was exposed to alcohol, I took it. And I don't recall ever drinking just to be sophisticated or to maybe to fit in, but I drank for the effect. And it progressed not too fast at first, but it really took off in college. And I thought it was terrific. I loved it mostly. I figured the consequence of hangovers and the blackouts that were happening were just simply a price to pay for the marvelous, wonderful experience of being loaded. And my goal was always I didn't really want to drink to pass out or to become completely out of it. I was always aiming for that particular balance point, which was always very momentary, and then I would always exceed. But it didn't stop me, and I kept it up, and it progressed, and it accelerated. And I started to recognize that it wasn't the way other people drank, and that it wasn't acceptable. So I started being a little more coy and a little more careful about it. I wasn't cutting down, but I was being more secretive. And it continued to progress. And I had things like falls and accidents and embarrassing moments and regrets, but I kept it up. And it just my history is it never slowed down and it only progressed. And there was a time when I actually recognized that this was probably alcoholism. I had a name, and that I should be much more discreet because someday I would need to curb this. Maybe I wasn't even calling it alcoholism yet. I just knew that it wasn't normal and it was getting extreme. And there would be a day when I better just cut it out or slow it down. But for now, I was doing it. I'm going to keep doing it. And I also loved alcohol, but the fact is, in the 70s, I took anything that came my way, like at parties or from friends. So I tried a number of drugs and smoked some marijuana. Some of it was like, okay, most of it was no big deal or not pleasant. Like I didn't really want to do that. But alcohol was the ticket. And I actually really considered alcohol for a number of years just a blessing. Like, oh my gosh, I found this and I wasn't even looking for it. And look at how marvelous it is. And then it became a bit more of a burden, but not anything I was going to stop. I just had to be more careful and eventually stop. And the real horror came in my life when I realized that I couldn't, that I kind of wanted to, and I couldn't. And it was causing problems. And I had a number of more years of drinking, knowing I was kind of in a bad cycle and I needed to always keep it undercover. So I continued to drink, and eventually I was like drinking 24/7. I did finish college and I did have a professional career. The way I was behaving and living my life, it was my career, my reputation, my actual life was always in jeopardy. I was living really risky in a way that I could lose my professional license. I was at risk of making really bad mistakes. I was driving drunk almost. I drove and I was always drunk, so I was pretty much driving in an affected state all the time when I drove. And I had a few minor accidents, but there were no injuries, a lot of damage, and there could have been a lot more. I just was lucky. I was never picked up for drunken driving. I deserved it. I should have been. There's a lot of things I did, both professionally and out in the civilized world, that was unlawful and not good for the rest of mankind. And I was doing it, and I was very ashamed. And I was also really frightened of where this was taking me. And I also was helpless. I felt totally hopeless and helpless. And I saw no way for it to stop. And in spite of all that, I never asked anybody for help. I never told anybody how much trouble I was in. And I knew I was. This was not a big secret to me. It was no mystery. I knew I was in really bad trouble. And I did, of course, have a word for it. And I knew it was alcoholism. I also thought it was somehow something deserving, that somehow I was responsible and that I just couldn't be a better person. So I had a lot of shame and good reason to be guilty. What happened was, for me, I consider one of those moments of grace, something besides me. And I couldn't really identify it at the time. What I've always called it is that I accidentally got help, because that's what happened. I accidentally told a loved one, my husband, who was very disturbed because he caught me in a state of almost passing out, and he didn't quite understand what was going on because I had been such a fraud, and I kept so much. I'd lived a double life. I lived with this man. We'd been married for 4 years, and I'd known him for 4 or 5 years before that really well. And he didn't see the real alcoholic. And I think that is nothing to be proud of, but I think an important piece of the kind of disease I had, in that I could use so much energy and talent, talent in not in a good way, of hiding my affliction. And it took everything out of my self-esteem as a fraud to do that, to still look respectable, to still have a profession, to somehow look like a woman moving around in the world who wasn't so damaged and living so destructively. And so I accidentally said to him, "Oh, honey, you should just leave." Because by then I was down in bed and I was trying to pass out. And I knew that was like right on the cusp of passing out. I said, "You should just leave. I'm an alcoholic." And that was not anything planned. And he heard it and he was stunned. And he says, well, how can that be? And we were cross country at the time. We were gonna leave for back to Seattle, where I live now. But I grew up in Minnesota, and we are on my parents' farm. It was the last night there, and I'd gotten really drunk, and this happened in my family home where I grew up. I barely got out of this big gathering of family. Barely. I mean, it was I can hardly remember, but I know there was some stumbling and crawling. And I got out and I was in my bed. I said, "Oh, just look in my bags," because our bags were ready for the morning car trip, 3-day trip. And of course I had these glass jugs of wine, because that was my drink, and that's how I got it. And I got a little stash to get me on the road. And then I was passed out. So I don't know what more happened. But by morning, we said goodbye to the family. big elephant in the room. Nobody said anything. They all wished us well. My parents looked at me a little nervously, but didn't, and I think my husband probably discussed some of it with them that night after I passed out. And he also called a friend to ask for help. And we got in the car and we went. We started our 3-day journey. And the friend he called was a colleague at work who he happened to know was helping other colleagues who were dealing with drug and alcohol problems. And he respected this man, liked him a lot. And my husband was desperate. And he's a very private, taciturn kind of guy. So that was a big deal. I realize now that he made a phone call to a colleague and told him what he was dealing with and asked him for help. And basically, I consider that a 12-step call, that the friend on the other end told my husband what to do to take care of me, to get me home safe, which was feed me a little bit of alcohol along the way to keep me from going into full-blown withdrawal. And so I did this 3-day trip in DTs, but they kept me from actually convulsing or getting too sick, but it was a nightmare and it was horrible. And if I said anything along the way, I was crying or I was saying, once we get there, you should just leave. Just leave me. I'm going to have to fend for myself. And I wasn't playing the martyr. I meant it. I wanted this guy he's a good man, and that he should ditch me because I had no hope. I figured, well, at least the secret's out, but I didn't know what I was going to do, and I saw no hope or end in sight. What happened was this fellow who was in AA actually, and he's still around, and I still know him, and he did that for my husband, and he also found me a bed in treatment. So when we got there 3 days later, I got dumped in detox. And that's how my journey began in recovery. I was given a chance to get detoxed. I needed a really safe, good medical detox, and I knew it because I knew I was in danger of having terrible complications. And I lost a couple days, and they didn't let me die, basically is the way I see it. They did not let me die, and they gave me a chance to start detoxing. Then I stayed in a 28-day treatment, and they introduced me to Alcoholics Anonymous. And it was a kind of a Hazleton modeled program. So I realize now a number of the people there were actually sober alcoholics themselves, but they were counselors and medical staff, and they taught the basics of alcoholism, of the disease of alcoholism, and also really pushed 12-step program is the way to deal with long term. And there was one little relapse when I got out of treatment. It wasn't little, I went home for a night. I did my 28 days. Actually, I got a weekend pass 2 weeks in. It wasn't a weekend pass, it was an afternoon. My husband picked me up, brought me home. He got out of sight. I never planned to do this, ever. But I looked in the fridge, and there were a couple beers in the back of the fridge, and they were half frozen, and I took care of them. And he didn't know. And I thought, well, nobody needs to know that. And I went on and went back to treatment. But I realized now I was doomed. I was doomed because I had done that, and I wasn't telling anybody. And I knew that my sober date wasn't what everybody thought it was. And so I got out then after the 28 days. And that very first night, I went to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in West Seattle. I drove myself, and I bought a bottle on the way up on Beacon Hill, and I was drunk at the meeting, and people were nice to me, and I'd never be able to find that meeting again. Somewhere in West Seattle, they told me, you keep coming back, you're going to be okay. Nobody called me on it that I was loaded. Got myself home. And the next day I went to a professional conference, which I had intentionally registered for. Actually, it was a Marty Mann It was one of the first Marty Mann, maybe the first, because she'd only died like a year before that. This was in the summer of 81. It was professionals in recovery. So it was nurses, doctors, counselors, people like that. I am a nurse, believe it or not. So that'll be a good thing for me. I'll do a professional conference and it'll keep me, it'll be a good thing for me to do my first day out. Well, I'd already been drinking the night before. I had a bottle under my car seat. It was at some hotel down by SeaTac. I was drinking all day. I was sitting with these other professionals, literally sitting at a table with people from the treatment center. Me acting like I was sober, another sober professional sitting there. And one of them said to me, she said, just kind of smell like oranges. And I don't know where that came from, but I was loaded and I was drinking wine out in my car. Anyway, I never made it home that night. They called my husband. I got loaded into a car and I got hauled right back to the same treatment place for another 28 days. And it was my low, they put me on a suicide watch and I thought, that's good. Let them think I'm going to commit suicide. I wasn't going to commit suicide, but I didn't know what the hell I was going to do. I did not know what I was going to do. I believed that this really was, I had enough of the big book in AA by then to, I thought, I'm just one of those people who cannot do this. I cannot. I don't believe I can be sober. And I can't go on. So I was at that, what am I going to do? I was pretty desperate. So I lasted and they hid out in my room and they made me come out and go to meetings and blah, blah. I did the whole thing all over. And I did. I hung on, went to meetings, and I got out of there after 28 days again. And this was for us a big deal. This was early in 1981. Our insurance plan didn't cover anything like that. I don't know. I don't think a lot of insurance plans did. So it was out of pocket. That was a big deal. I felt more shame and guilt what I was costing my husband and what I was doing, how much had I damaged. But I got out and the other important part of my story is I still had a really strong compulsion to drink, a mental obsession and a physical compulsion. I was still driven like that. So it was literally, I was living an hour by hour, day by day, desperately wanting to be sober and desperately hoping I wouldn't pick up. And what I did was I went to a lot of meetings. I got in my car and I drove to meetings 3-4 times a day. And I didn't share much, but I got a lot. I really got a lot. I remember leaving meetings feeling selfish, like people had shared so much and given me so much strength and hope and given me a chance for another hour, hour and a half. A lot of the meetings were an hour and a half then. That I was safe and okay for an hour. And so that's what I did. And that went on, and people were good to me. AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, men and women welcomed me, smiled at me. People like Dean, who passed away a couple of years ago, was one of the first people, or one guy I used to see really often at a couple of the meetings I went to. And he would always be kind to me and say things like, Jeannie, you're going to be okay. You just keep coming back here. Nobody nobody made me do anything. They told me what they were doing. They always welcomed me. And I knew that was a safe place. And I'm really grateful for that I never felt, I was never questioning. I wasn't cynical. I didn't suspect people were telling me tall tales. I believed them. I believed their stories. And eventually it worked its way in for me. And then I started, but it took me months to believe I could do that I could do what other people were doing. And I was surprised day after day I wasn't drinking. That was just incredible. There's the promises, if we are painstaking before we will, we have these promises before we were halfway through. And my story is I felt like I was not painstaking, like I was not, that I was doing it mediocre, but that I was showing up and I wasn't drinking. And I was amazed. I was truly amazed, and I wasn't halfway through anything, but I was amazed that I could be sober one more day, one more day, one more day. And I think was really important for me. I needed to pile on those days and get a little bit of protection. And what I also was doing, in spite of myself, I didn't understand. I believed in being that we had to have some kind of higher power. It wasn't an issue. I didn't balk at that. I believed that there was some kind of God or higher power. My childhood higher power was called God. I prefer, as much as I can remember, to condition myself to always say higher power now, because that just feels more inclusive and more comforting to me than the God I remember as a child, because that wasn't a God that was going to, it was insignificant. I was insignificant. I didn't think it was terrible or anything, but I never expected him to have my back or to be loving or to take care of me. And what's happened is, by listening to other people and understanding their ideas about higher powers and some kind of spiritual life, that in fact I could have that too. And that in fact I did. I always did. It was just dormant and I hadn't been tapping it. And it took me being sober a while and just slowly developing kind of this spirituality through knowing and the other things I was introduced to in Alcoholics Anonymous, authors that were not AA approved, but authors that were spiritual, other practices that were spiritual, that I have a really strong belief now that, and I have for quite a number of years, that I do have a powerful, loving, kind, higher power. And I have to say it out loud to myself. I say it in meetings. I repeat it to sponsees, because that it reinforces it for me and reminds me. Because if I don't do stuff like that, I revert right back to being the bad girl with the God out to get her. And so I need to be reminded.
I think that a share about your getting a sponsor, not having a sponsor, having sponsees. I'm always interested too in a little bit of the history of AA in Seattle, what it was like in 1981 in contrast to what it's like now.
Yeah, boy, what I was doing when I got out of treatment, and because it had been drummed into me, and I also believed it, and I knew it was helping me, was to go to AA meetings. And I live in the south end of Seattle, and this was before the new floating bridge or anything, but I had pretty easy access to I-90, and traffic wasn't as horrendous as it is now. And I would drive back and forth to the east side. The reason for that is that that's actually where I knew a few sober people, because those are the people I met when I was in treatment, because I was in treatment up in Kirkland. There were women from an AA group at the Bellevue Alano Club who came out to the treatment center, and one woman in particular whose name was Anna T, who's gone now. But Anna T came out with her car. She had some old big American car, and it was noisy and clunky. And she was inviting any women to come with her if they wanted to go to this Saturday morning meeting. And I don't know what possessed me, but I thought, well, what the hell? I'm gonna get out of here and go to a meeting. And I did that a number of Saturdays with her. And I don't recall a whole bunch of other women swarming to do that, but there probably were a few. And so I met women in Eastside AA. And I also was so I went back and forth to the Alano Club, because that's what I knew when I got out. And they had meetings there multiple times a day. I'd go in the morning, I'd go at noon, I'd go sometimes at the 5 o'clock, I'd sometimes go to the 8 o'clock. I started going to women's meetings on the east side, Tuesdays, Saturdays, Fridays. They're probably still going on. That's how I got to know people. Anna, who picked me up one of those first Saturdays, I actually put her, that's back in the day when there would be a sign-in sheet, and you'd put your sober date and who your sponsor was, and maybe your home group, I don't know. And I would make things up. I mean, I told my real sober date, and I hung on to my real sober date, July 23rd, 1981. I hung on to that. Like, don't want to ever change it, don't want to ever lose it. It's a really important date. And I made up, I pretended that Anna T was my sponsor. I did call her once in a while. She didn't know she was my sponsor. And the reason I was doing that is I was kind of planning that I would never do anything more than the first 3 steps. And the first 3 steps were really powerful for me and very effective. I mean, I could do them, and they helped me a lot. Reading from the 12 and 12, reading from the big books, sitting at step meetings. And I did sit in all step meetings, all, 1 through 12. I went to groups that would rotate and do the steps. And so I was familiar with all the steps, but my reasoning was somewhere along the line, some old timer said, you could stay sober doing 1, 2, 3. I mean, like, one person said that. Everybody else is saying, you do all the steps, you get to 4 and 5, you do the steps, you get a sponsor. But so I'm a good girl and I need to put somebody down on the sheet. So it's Anna T. And because I was never going to do a 4th and 5th, because that was just going to be asking way too much. I wasn't going to be able to do that. I knew there was a whole lot of bad things about me and stuff I already knew, and I knew there were things I didn't even know. I suspected there was a whole bunch I could uncover that I didn't even know, and I didn't want to know. I did not want to know. And I thought I could get away with that. And I actually stayed sober in a very dangerous, vulnerable position to be in. But I sat in meetings and I was desperate to be sober, but not desperate enough to do a 4th step. And I went to a lot of meetings and I started working again. And I had a great social life, and I have really good supportive friends. There's still friends. I still have a few friends around who knew me and were there, drank with me and knew me when I was in treatment, and have always supported my recovery. So I feel very, very fortunate. I'm also still married to that man. So it's been like 46 years we've been married. That poor man married a drunk on his wedding day, and I knew that. I knew I was an alcoholic. I wasn't drunk. I take it back, because I intentionally did not drink. That was one rare day when I did not drink. I wasn't going to wreck my wedding day. It's so remarkable I could do that. But I also wasn't going to tell him. And then he found out 4 years later. So I was going to have my first child. I was almost 5 years sober. And I was keeping undercover a whole lot of wreckage. And I think that was my motivation, that I have to do this. I'm going to have to do a 4th step. So I actually did. And I didn't have a real sponsor, but I knew a woman who's still around, who's still a good friend of mine, who I asked her if she would listen to a 5th step. And she's this really wonderful woman who is always helping men and women in AA. So I did this mediocre 4th step, and she sat with me and listened to my 5th step. And that opened doors for me. That was one of those really big leaps in recovery, in that I actually felt like I'd finally joined the club, like I was really doing what I was supposed to do. And it was a relief. And I've done a number of really thorough 4th steps, and there's always more. And I've had several sponsors, really good sponsors. Pat Stromberg, who's died now, but she was really well known on the East Side. She was a longtime sponsor of mine. There's a lot of people who probably still remember her. And she died, and another sponsor I had, Helen, who was a little older than me and was a wonderful sponsor, but she died. And I have a longtime sponsor now, and I'm very transparent with her. And that's part of the path. It's like, and I brought it up to her, and she knows my history. and that no matter what's going on, I will be transparent and straightforward with her. And that's huge, because then I know somebody else knows I'm being honest with somebody. So anyway, I do fourths and fifths. Actually, way back with Pat, still at the Alano Club, she made me take a sponsee one day in a meeting, because some woman was sharing and she was struggling. And she said, you're going to go talk to her and you're going to see if she has a sponsor. So that was my first sponsee. Then I would lean on Pat to get guidance. But in the years since, I've had a number of sponsees and I cherish them. And I have some awesome women in my life who I feel like I get so much more from than I have to give to them. But it's just the way it is. I think it's how we give back and forth to each other. And I learn a lot about myself listening to sponsees, just listening. And then when we do share back and forth, I'm real aware that so often what I'm saying, I need to say for myself. And it's like really powerful. Like I find myself saying things that I go, well, yeah, because it applies to me. And I think that's a gift of the program. There's nowhere else I would be like that, do that. So the other thing that happened, I mean, just for history, there was a really good meeting that I went to all the time. It was a mixed meeting down at the bathhouse in Madison Park. It was a Friday night meeting. And it was a great meeting. And there were a number of meetings down there, including Saturday Promises, the Son of Madison, and I think there was at least one other, like a Tuesday evening meeting. And what happened years ago was the rent structure changed down there. This is my understanding of it. So that building's owned by the Parks Department. And so the AA groups that were having meetings down there rented, their space, and the rent went really high, and a number of groups couldn't sustain that. And so they had to find new meeting places. Well, the Friday night meeting, which had actually so many people had gone through there and people had recovered, and that meeting was mixed, gay, straight, men, women. This was in the 80s when HIV was just really decimating our ranks. There's a lot of particularly young men I knew from down there that I lost during that time, that were involved down in, especially that Friday night meeting, but a number of meetings around Seattle. But that one meeting, the Friday night meeting, it never found another place and it folded. And there was a little money left over in the treasury, and somebody was hanging on to that. There were other meetings. I mean, I went to meetings all over. I live in the South End and I wanted a Friday night meeting closer to home. That was my motivation. So I approached the church in Mount Baker and I asked the pastor, who I kind of knew. It wasn't my church, but I knew him. He'd been there a while and he's still there. He's been there a long time. And I explained my history and that I was interested in maybe starting an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting there on Friday evenings. And he was so thrilled because he had said, oh, we just had a whatever they do with their board and their other elders and stuff, a meeting. And we really were lamenting how we want to do more outreach, particularly, in all areas. And we would love to have a recovery program, a meeting happening. And so we talked about it. And so there I go. I have a spot to meet on Friday night. And he said, oh, and I said, and we will, we'll pay rent. What kind of rent? Can you ask the board or whoever? He says, oh, no, we would want you to just be here. And I explained to him that, no, we had to pay something because we were self-supporting and that we would be, and that I would come up with something with the people and we would be paying rent monthly. So we did. We paid like a percentage of whatever was collected in the basket. But so I got that meeting started. I talked to intergroup. I got a little format. We did this meeting and it's called the Mount Baker Friday night meeting. that meeting started, I date it because the first meeting was in May, and my son was 11 years old because it was his birthday that day, and this child is now 30. But that meeting lasted every Friday, and I got a lot of support from, initially people came from the Empire Way group, because at the time that was my home group. I'd been down there going Monday, Wednesday, every Monday, Wednesday, and they came to, open up that meeting, and people from the Friday night meeting that had folded at the bathhouse, and new people from the neighborhood. It built up over time, and part of the story is that treasury money that was left over from the Friday night meeting at the bathhouse. We used that meeting to buy a coffee pot and buy some literature to get us started. And I would walk across the street and go to that meeting. It was a nice Friday night meeting. And it lasted until into COVID, and it hasn't reopened. And I don't know that it will unless one of us initiates it again. And I've thought about that off and on. But now there are other meetings there. There have been other meetings at that church, and there still are. A couple Sunday night meetings. For a while, there was a Bulimics Anonymous meeting. And for a while, there was compulsive overeaters meeting. So that's part of my history there.
Just incidentally, do you remember when Saturday Promises moved to the Park Shore?
It would have been about the same time. They had to find a new home. Where did we go? Saturday Promises didn't go directly to Park Shore. Saturday Promises went somewhere else nearby. Maybe not. Maybe they did. Maybe that was the only place they went. Yeah, maybe. Because I was going there regularly and going to Park Shore. So whatever that date was it would have been in the 90s. And I still actually have some original stuff, like the format and stuff from that Friday night meeting as a memory for me. I'm gonna just, it would have been 23 years ago. Yeah, it would have been about 23 years ago, May. And they moved pretty quickly. They didn't fall apart. Well, I mentioned the Bulimics Anonymous. Part of my story is when I first got into treatment, I was also had a pretty raging eating disorder that I was not acknowledging and did not acknowledge until several years into my alcohol recovery. And it came out piecemeal, and it came out with therapy, and it came out with me maturing in my sobriety and wanting to be more fully present. I see now as really another hardcore addiction for me anyway. And it made me in my early years of recovery feel less than sober, like I was cheating on the side. And I needed to clean it up. And it took me a while, and it took me a lot of therapy. What I say, and I've talked to a number of people over the years, when I disclose that, people then share about their own eating disorders that go along with their other addictions, or maybe not. But for me, the way I was able to get recovery around that took me a number of years, and it also took me staying sober. I had to stay sober, and I had to stay sober as long as I was, and do the work I was doing, and doing the step work I was doing, and having the really wonderful sponsorship that I had, and therapy and outside stuff. It was slow progress. Like with my alcoholism, I do not drink no matter what. My eating disorder, it got better and it got better and it got better. For a long time, it was never better. I mean, it was always just disaster right along with my drinking. But as I got into AA, I made a slow progress. to the point where it's like a lifetime issue, but it's not. It's not disabling, and it's not something that is actively going on, and it hasn't been for a number of years. Another AA friend and I initiated the Bulimics Anonymous. That was a meeting that was active for, I don't know, maybe a couple of years over at the church. My partner in crime, who was, God, Betty, was sober longer than me even. And she moved, and that meeting kind of fell apart, but we'd put that together ourselves, and we made up. She went to AA all the time too. So the two of us, all we knew was Alcoholics Anonymous, and we modeled a recovery program for ourselves, and other people came. There's lots you can do when you're sober. So that's part of my story. And I do now. I've talked to, over the years, a number of people who have either they've revealed it in a meeting, or I've somehow alluded to that part of my history, and then we share. I realize I should probably more, because it's not a little thing. There's a number of people who have, and I know from being around a while, there's a lot of other addictions that people have to find help for, sometimes in other programs or outside help. And for me, that was one of them. And it jeopardized my sobriety. It always jeopardized my sobriety. And it always jeopardized my health and my self-esteem and my ability to have a spiritual connection. That was a big motivation. I was getting closer and closer to a higher power, and that behavior didn't jive.
What about, sounds like you've done a lot of service in a variety of ways. Do you want to say anything more about service?
I've been a treasurer for some meeting. I can't remember what. I did a lot of stuff at Empire Way. And I still, once in a while, I love that meeting, and I still know lots of people there. And I was a regular home group meeting for years and did service there in several different capacities. I branched out and I did some outside meetings, things like a GSR, and I know I did Grapevine Rep a number of times for different meetings. I've secretaried meetings. I prefer doing other people. My opinion is other people have the passion and the skills to do more of the district level and intergroup level service positions. I've done, at some level, I've done them all. They've all been interesting, and I'm glad I've done them, but they're not my niche, and I'm not a natural, and I prefer to do sponsoring and within groups, secretaries, like on Zoom, hosting, co-hosting. There's a lot of service we can do since we've been on Zoom.
Why don't you say something about Zoom? How did you feel when it first started, and how do you feel now about it?
Yeah, because that feels like a lifesaver to me now. In fact, I know it is. What, has it been almost 3 years? Over 2.5? Since about March 2020. And my home group, PTP, Practice These Principles, I had to leave in-person meetings one of the early on, and the meeting held on in person for a while, but it was starting to look dicier and more unsafe to me. So I was not having a meeting. But then eventually, it just, due to state and county regulations and in the progression of the COVID pandemic, everything was shutting down. And so the meeting really had no choice. The church had to shut down, our meeting space had to shut down. And I thought, and people were talking about Zoom. I mean, this was all within a matter of days that they're gonna set that up. And they did. People like Bailey made it happen. And I was talking to him, and he actually asked me to secretary that first meeting that he was going to have on Zoom. I said, okay. And then the more I thought about it, I got just chicken shit. I just thought, I can't, I'm not going to even be able to log on. Like I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to do it. I thought, I can't do that. I'm just going to have to bail out. And I guess I'm just going to tough this out. Can't last that long, I thought. I'm not going to drink over it. So I'm just not going to be able to do that. So I remember, and I never do this, renege. But I said, Bailey, I can't do that. I'm not going to be able to open the meeting tomorrow. I'm not going to be able to log on. And he was really kind about it. And he got somebody else who did it. But then in the meantime, like in the next day or so, he walked me through setting up Zoom on my computer. I think some of it, I was just given some outside help because I don't have skills like that. But I got it set up and I've been doing Zoom nonstop since March of 2020. It's opened up my world. That's how I know this other meeting that I mentioned early in the interview, the women's spiritual awakening. Both those meetings, the Monday, Wednesday, Friday one and the daily one, which are separate meetings, different formats and everything. They both were started by AA women who wanted a Zoom meeting. And I have met people like I know and care a lot about and have really tight relationships with that I only know on Zoom. What's happened just recently in the last 6 months or so, I've finally done a couple trips away from home. And I actually went to Honolulu just a couple weeks ago. And I met people that I've known and loved for over 2 years. It's remarkable. I feel like I've been getting really terrific recovery and fellowship doing Zoom meetings. Some ways even better because I hit more but I still miss, I will say, I miss in person and the couple of opportunities I've had to be in person. I went to the annual intergroup picnic this year, which was down at Seward Park. It was a nice day. I felt safe, like I could do that outside. And it was just remarkable and so refreshing to just be with other alcoholics, meeting some people I'd never met before that I only knew on Zoom, and seeing people I'd known for years and hadn't seen for a long time. Everybody tells stories like that, I know, when they reconnected. So I just think Alcoholics Anonymous is so resourceful. And so we've lasted all these years and we've done things like through COVID and through a couple of wars and through a lot of turmoil in our world, personally and worldwide and countrywide. And here we are. And before all this happened, my husband and I got to travel quite a bit in retirement before COVID hit. And I was going to meetings all over the world in person. Really wonderful, wonderful experiences, meeting people and staying in touch with some. So yeah, I'm glad to talk about that in history and the wonder and beauty of Alcoholics Anonymous and how resilient and resourceful we are. But then again, it's life and death. It's life and death. I think that for me anyway, that is a powerful motivation to stay intact, to stay connected, to take care of each other, to save my own life. We do these sorts of things. It's also given me the skills I believe the skills and the will to do other things in my life that are not actually recovery things, but things out in the world. Some volunteer activities I do. I actually, in early recovery before I had children, my husband and I learned to climb. And so we were climbing mountains. And I climbed all the big glaciers in the Northwest. And I'm not a natural. I am not a climber. Oh, I did rock climbs too. That was even more challenging. Some people are just natural. They just can climb. They just climb and they're They're fearless and they're good, they're agile, and I'm not like a hardcore athlete. I'm afraid. I had a lot of fear. I think that it had to be for me being a sober woman and having some of the health and strength and resourcefulness that I have, that I did that, and it was a wonderful experience, especially the glacier climbs, because they're really endurance feats. You need skill and you need some good judgment, and so we had a lot of good training through the mountaineers. And I met a lot of good people, and in fact, a few recovery people, because you accidentally meet them on things like this. I had the gumption, I guess, and the safety to climb high mountains and do the endurance, because I knew basically the whole business of 1 foot after another, 1 foot at a time. So that was terrific. It really was, it was like, that's how you do it. And that's how I stayed sober and still do. But boy, it saved my life early, 1 day at a time, from meeting to meeting. So I would just do one step at a time. And I loved it. It was very spiritual, really close to my higher power doing that. So it's something I got to do.
Well, Jean, we're closing in on the end of this interview. I was wondering if you had any particular favorite phrase or passage from the big book that you'd like to share with us.
I do. And I think how about the 12 and 12?
Yeah, 12 and 12 is good.
It's one I've had for years, Judith, and I first heard it when I was at a meeting with fellows, small group at somebody's home, because somebody was convalescing, as I recall. And I remember whatever we were doing, and I think it must have been, maybe it was step 11. I've always said, I find myself saying something that's really powerful for me and that I truly believe in is a big source of strength, inner strength, is that idea of that unshakable foundation for life. And for me, I carry it through to my powerful personal higher power that I have. And it comes from the line in the step 11 in the 12 and 12 in front on page 89. And they're talking about the direct linkage between self-examination, meditation, and prayer. Taken separately, these practices can bring much relief and benefit. But when they are logically related and interwoven, and this is my phrase that I hang on to, the result is an unshakable foundation for life. And that was something I didn't know was possible, nor was I seeking, but it's something I know I acquired by being sober and staying sober. And it wasn't something I recognized immediately. It was over time, but it's been for a long time. And it's a really solid belief of mine. And it's a fallback for me, no matter how shaky I get. I somehow will remember that I have that unshakable foundation for life. And it's part of my spiritual power.
This is so great, Jean. Thank you so very, very much.
Okay, I'll see you in the usual places.